Once again, welcome back to Mr. Scare. I have noticed that you guys enjoy listening to night driving horror stories. So for today's horror podcast, I have 7 new road trip horror stories. But before I begin, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular uploads. So I work the night shift, so apart from the creepy things that I experience at my workplace, I am also driving at ghostly hours all the time. So one time I got permission to get home early from work because I was sick, and I decided to take the longer and slower road home. It was less bumpy, and although a longer road, it was a safer, and more importantly, easier way to drive home. So just for context, my usual way takes me 20 to 30 minutes to get home, but depending on the traffic lights, this way takes me around 40 to 50 minutes. It was obviously a longer route, but because of the lights, I didn't have to concentrate on the road as much. I was going through the town and managed to make all the lights so far. The time was somewhat like 3:20 a.m., so no one was on the road, and maybe that made it a little creepy. It was a cool misty night, and as usual, I saw a red light coming up, so I slowed down and stopped. I knew that light was going to take a while, so I whipped out my phone to check my messages. And as I was scrolling through my Instagram feed, I heard a bang on my passenger side door. The sudden loud knocking scared the shit out of me, and I dropped my phone on the floor and looked over to the window to see no one. At least for the first few seconds, because at first, there was no one to be seen at the window, but then slowly, a middle-aged drunk man rises from the bottom of the window, smiling like a creep. He did not even get to the top and just stopped in the middle of the window and slowly started tilting his head from side to side. It didn't look like he wanted food or anything, he just got some pleasure upon seeing me. So he just kept on staring into my soul until I felt like I was getting hypnotized. I mean, I never intended to pull my windows down, but I had already pulled them nearly halfway down. I kinda snapped out of it when his finger ring hit the door while he had tried to put his hand inside the car to unlock it. Needless to say, that was the only time when I've ever run a red light and touched the red line on my car's speedometer. In retrospect, I should have seen him somewhere around when I got to the red light. But I never did. I wonder how. But if he was a ghost or a spirit, what would be the need to unlock the door to enter inside? Maybe he was just a creep who wanted to steal my car or mug me. I got home and rested. Another time, I was taking my usual way home. I normally finish at 6:30 in the morning, but because of some scheduling issues at work, I got sent home at 4:30 a.m. So it was around 4:50 a.m., and I was doing like 90 miles an hour on the back streets heading towards my house. My high beams were turned on as I listened to music at full volume, having a great time by myself. I came around the corner, and it was quite a long road. But up the road within close distance, I could see someone in the middle of the road, wearing a white hoodie. So I flicked my high beams off and started slowing down, thinking that he was going to move. But he didn't. I stopped like 3 or 4 meters away from him and saw that it was a white sheet, draped over a standing stick thingy, with a piece of paper attached to it in big bold writing, saying "Come closer and have a look." Now I am not sure if it were some teens having some fun and pranking the drivers, or if I was going to get mugged after getting out of the car. But not being an idiot, I very quickly floored my car around the sheet and gunned it toward home. I got home and made sure everything was locked. I have a few more, but these 2 have been among the scariest that I have ever experienced. Because, unlike other instances, here I was probably just a few moments away from disaster. When I was in high school, my friends and I used to drive out to this graveyard that was just outside Hobart, Indiana. This was literally in the middle of nowhere, and at night it would be dark as hell. The entire cemetery gave off vibes of a top-level horror story. It was not so huge in the area, and it was claimed or rumored that there was an angel statue in the very middle of the graveyard. And whenever anyone got close to it, the temperature was supposed to drop. We had tried it before, and it did seem like this happened, like the temperature took a sudden drop. But I'm sure that it had something to do with just the weather. So one night, like 12 of us go just to get scared. We walk around the graveyard, explore it, and have a good time in general. I mean, we were teens at that time, and we got a kick out of such dumb things. We left from there after a while. We had in 2 cars. I'm driving behind the first one, and being a dumb 18-year-old, I'm following the girl driving the car in front of me pretty closely. It was a back road. It was not even well lit, and there were no other cars in sight for miles. Of course, that was the case since it was late as hell. All of a sudden, she swerves all the way into the other lane. I panic watching her do this, and I swerve too, thinking that there must be a deer in the front. She slows down and comes to a stop. I turn to spot the deer. But no, it was not a deer. There was a tombstone, that too in the middle of the goddamn road. It sounds like the stupidest thing you've ever heard, but I swear it. It was right there, in front of our eyes. Initially excited about this discovery, we gradually had a bad feeling about it. It looked freakish. And we had just been in a cemetery where all others looked the way they were supposed to. And this was no different, except that it looked demonic or sinister to all of us. It kinda compelled us or tempted us to get down and get close to it. But none of us dared to. And I'm not sure why or how, but all of a sudden, there was dead silence all around. No bugs or wind or any other sounds at all. I never intended to stay there for even a minute more, but as I said, we were dumb teens. Someone from the car ahead of us opened the rear seat door to step out. But before they could, a loud growl made us jump from our seats. It was followed by a subsequent set of loud footsteps that were heading toward us from the side. We floored it and gunned our cars to the town. We did not stop until we got to the main town and then parked on the side to speak about it. We decided to go there the next day to check it out. But yes, during the daytime. What kinda disturbed us was that it was our usual route while coming back home. And we never encountered such a gravestone in the middle of that road before. The next day, the previous night's encounter was still fresh in our heads as we drove towards it. We were very extremely alert this time. We reached and found that there was no such gravestone there. We were stunned. We drove around the cemetery twice and never run into it. And there were no signs of any digging done on the road too. It was as if either there was no stone in the first place, or it vanished into thin air. And I'm not sure as to which possibility should scare me more. And listen, I don't believe in ghosts. In fact, I don't believe in heaven or hell, or anything of that. But I know what I saw. And apart from me being one individual who might have imagined it all, there were 11 other people who saw the same thing. We talked about it for years to come. But no one seemed to believe us or our story. They thought we were just fooling around and making up a story. When I was about 17, my parents scolded me and sternly asked me to get home because a huge snowstorm was about to hit town. Not the town, the entire city, and surrounding parts, to be honest. I was at my boyfriend's place at that time and having a fun time with him. So when I was asked to get my butt home, I threw a fit, and my parents were like,
"Fine. But you have to drive yourself home and be home by curfew."
Oh, and just so you know, my curfew time was 8:30 p.m. Now I had never driven in the snow, especially in this kind of a snowstorm. It hadn't blown out in proportions, but there were signs that it was going to get worse and violent from there. I left his house around 6:30, and there were already about 4 inches of snow on the ground. And it was still snowing quite heavily. It was also pitch black out there. Driving in the snow is just creepy to the core. There's endless darkness around, and a white floor. So poor visibility and poorer grip on the road. Now both, my boyfriend and my parents lived in this small farming town, so I was only about 10 minutes up the road. So it should have been easy to get home, right? Hell no! The whole drive from his home to my home took around an hour. I couldn't see anything with the vortex of snow around me. There weren't many streetlights in my town. I could barely go and drive at a speed of 3 or 4 miles an hour in my tiny car. I might have been able to drive a little faster, but I did not want to risk my car breaking down in the middle of the road, and that too during a snowstorm. As I almost reached home and I could literally see my street, my headlights illuminated a little girl in the middle of the road. And what caught my attention was that she was not dressed for the weather at all. I slammed my brakes, but due to the snow, I skidded for about a quarter mile. I felt the impact of hitting her. I was praying that she would not have been hurt much. When I finally did stop, I got out with my phone's flashlight to look for her. But there was nobody to be seen. I decided that it was best to get home and tell my parents. We lived next door to the town's fire department, so my dad had called them up and asked them to go and look for her. They easily found where my car had put the brakes on, but nobody was there. There was damage to my headlight, so I definitely hit something, but they couldn't find anything. To this day my dad says it must have been a deer, but I know what I saw. And what surprised me more is that there were no trail or tracks of anything else on the road, apart from my car's tire tracks. Had there been a girl or a deer, there would have been some footsteps visible. I have no explanation for what I saw or for what hit my car that night. But it was something that gives me chills even today. I was around 23 years old when this happened to me. 3 of my girlfriends and I were driving from a city to a rural country house for a chill weekend. This was back in early 2005. The trip was fun. We were having fun on our journey to the place too. And everything was going normal as we got more and more rural and deeper into the countryside. It had started to get darker and darker as time passed, but we weren't so bothered by it. Towards the end of our journey, it was dark outside, and the road was barely visible to the eye. It was so twisty and bendy to drive on, and we were all getting more and more anxious since we didn't really know where this house was. Honestly, it felt like we were driving into the middle of nowhere. The area was totally isolated. Just trees all around us, and the path in front of us. Then suddenly, as we slowly twisted and turned down this black road which we could barely see, this haunting, creepy, horror-like music started playing from out of nowhere. It sounded like some haunting organ funeral music. And no, it wasn't coming from the radio. We knew that it was a possibility, but the radio was off for an hour or so because there was no network. Despite that, we turned it on again and then switched it off to hear the static. So it wasn't coming from the radio, and it was no one's phone too. It seemed like it was coming from inside the car. But it was weird. Not the music. I mean, yeah, the music was weird and creepy. But what I found weird was that all of us were sitting on different sides of the car. And if it was coming from one specific outlet, we all would have turned towards it. But that was not the case. All of us checked our very close to our bodies as if it was coming from within us. It was as if the music was playing in our heads. But in our heads? How? If one of us was hallucinating or imagining the music, then it would have been a plausible explanation. But this was unbelievable. It lasted for about 4 to 5 minutes as we drove through the route. For some seconds, it would get louder and then get lower, as if we were in some sort of a game. I mean, that's what my brother suggested when I narrated the incident to him. He said that in video games, music starts playing whenever we are near some enemy. And the music actually faded away as we drove further, and it ended once we moved past that area. We all heard it, and it was creepy as hell. To this day, I don't know what it was. But if it was some creepy ghost, then I am thankful to God that I could escape before it could do any harm to me. I went with my cousin on a trip to a beach in Mexico. While we were heading back from the trip, I decided to have a little nap, and in that nap, I had a dream about the television on the bus going on and off, and my cousin praying. I also dreamed about an old man with a little girl in a blue dress asking for a ride, to which I told the bus driver to not stop, because it was a spirit. Then in the same dream, I noticed that since we did not pick up the old guy with the little girl, everything changed and there was a fire on the hill, and we were trying to escape from it. At the end of the dream, we ended up in a little town in the middle of nowhere. I woke up from my dream suddenly, and when I told my cousin this story, he laughed at it. Then we started talking about other things, and all of a sudden, the televisions on the bus started to malfunction, and the bus driver told us that it was nothing. We both were a little worried and cautious about it. The both of us decided to go and talk to him, and that's when we noticed an old man asking for a ride with a little girl wearing blue. Now we were in the middle of the mountains, and there was no one living there. Literally no towns and no life. And then a few miles later, there he was again, asking for a lift. I told the bus driver mockingly that it was a ghost. He laughed and told me that it was the third time that he saw it. My cousin was so scared that he started praying. I was starting to think that I was still in a dream. But I guess I wasn't. We got into a military checkpost where there were only 4 guys there. One of them told us to be careful because since it was winter season, the roads were slippery because of the altitude of the mountain. Around 20 minutes later, we noticed a huge fire in the mountains, and the bus stopped working. There was no cell phone signal, and there were no cars passing by, and it was freezing outside. Finally, a girl passenger managed to find some signal on her device and contacted 911. They were coming for us, and while we waited inside the bus, there was something or someone outside knocking on the windows of the bus. And not just me, but all of us could hear little feet running around on the roof of the bus. We went outside to see what it was, and it was nothing. 5 ambulances arrived and took us to a little Masonic town. So yeah, we ended up in a town in the middle of nowhere, exactly like my dream. Ever since I got my license, I've done a lot of driving, especially long distances across the country, and that too at night. I've never rarely ever had anything unexplainable happen to me, but I've had my fair share of scary and creepy stuff. One time when I was driving out in the West, I saw a road covered with hundreds of rattlesnakes. The only explainable part is that they like the heat of the pavement, and that might have pulled them all outside their dwellings and on the road. The scary part is that I drive a big semi-truck, and I gotta go to different places. So I was running over rattlesnakes, and for some reason in my mind, I am thinking that one of these snakes is going to be hanging underneath the step up into the truck and bite me when I get out at the next stop. Needless to say, I just chose to jump from the truck as far as I could. But then when I got back in the truck, I realized that I had left my door open when I went about my business. So I started thinking if one of those snakes entered the truck. I drove the entire way with one eye on the road, and the other eye searching for snakes hiding inside my vehicle. I remember another incident when I had moved to a very rural town in Michigan and lived outside of that in an even smaller town. That town was what one might call the dark sky territory. Anyway, it was my first night staying there. I had only seen a couple of locals, and they definitely looked like the hills have eyes kinda way, with U-shaped mullets and the bald spot on the top. Everyone kept eyeballing me as I drove by. Anyway, there was a thunderstorm there, and the power went out in the cabin where I was staying in. It was the darkest experience I've ever been in. Pitch black all around the place. Something or the other was making noise all night long, and I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. Back then I didn't have a flashlight, lighter, cell phone, or anything with me. In the morning when I got up, the windows on my car were all busted, and there were no branches laying around. So yup, I got in the car and just drove the hell right out of Michigan to Minnesota. Way before COVID happened, Walmart used to be open 24/7. My husband had the second shift, so he would get off work late at night. After work, we would go and visit Walmart. So this took place at around 3 or 4 a.m. in the middle of the night. On our way back home from Walmart, maybe a block from our house, we saw an elderly woman walking in the middle of the street in her nightgown. She had white hair, and I won't deny that we didn't get a bit freaked out. We calmed down and drove up to her. We asked if she was okay, to which she replied,
"I'm looking for my husband. Have you seen him anywhere?"
She looked confused. We didn't know where she lived, so we called 911. We told her we would wait with her till her husband showed up. After a few minutes, the cops showed up. It turned out that she had Alzheimer's disease and lived 3 blocks down. she had wandered off and was looking for her husband who had passed away a long time back. My husband had another creepy experience. This happened back when he was still my boyfriend. We weren't driving, and we were sitting outside my old house around 2 a.m. It was the summer before going back to school for our senior year. We're talking with our camping chairs outside, snacking on some goodies. That was when we saw a man dressed in a long sleeve and white shirt, sliding. Not walking, but sliding in the middle of the park. I used to live in front of a big park, and at night it would be very dark with trees all around and only a couple of light poles. It was so creepy to see that it still gives me the chills. I had a pretty creepy experience while I was driving in Brisbane, Australia. Luckily, I was not alone at that hour. I was driving home with some friends in the car, and we saw this guy dressed like an invisible man. He was freakishly tall and very thin, head and hands completely wrapped in bandages, wearing a trench coat and fedora-type hat, just walking down the middle of a busy motorway. As we drove past him, he moved his head to follow our car, but we couldn't see if there was any way for him to see through the bandages. We absolutely shit ourselves and started yelling at one another since we were extremely terrified. Now being the driver, I decided to pull into a side street and turn around to get back on the main road and try to get another look at him. But literally 15 seconds after we first spotted him, he was gone. No trace of him whatsoever. We started to drive home again, all wondering as to what the hell had just happened, and as we turned into our little street in a neighborhood that was like a labyrinth on a hill, my heart sank as I noticed this towering motherfucker walking towards us on our very own damn street. Not only was it frightening to see that he had watched us drive by and had somehow managed to end up on our street. Also for perspective, the distance from the very first sighting to my home was about 3 miles, and he had made that distance, on foot, in about 10 minutes. We kept driving around for hours that night, too scared to go home, and eventually, when we decided to get home, there was no sight of him. So we locked every door and window, while sitting with makeshift weapons in the living room all night. I still don't have any explanation for it, and no one else that I've ever spoken to about it has ever seen the thing, or even anything close to it for that matter. We live right near one of the largest cemeteries in Australia, and many strange people hung around there, but this guy was too tall and too freaky to be a real human. I didn't feel safe in that neighborhood for a long time after that, and I moved as soon as I could. Luckily, I never spotted him ever again. In the small town in the southern part of America where I grew up, there was a highway that was almost never used. It was always claimed to be a huge waste of resources, because despite being a large 4-lane highway, it doesn't really connect any two major destinations. Although it does lead into the city of the major state university that is a couple of hours away. My dad told me the only reason they built it was because some alumni pushed for its construction so that people had an alternate route to get to the university during football season. It never made any sense to me, but whatever. One night, my girlfriend and I were driving on this highway, where there is a rare occurrence to see another car on a non-game day in the fall. And there was a guy standing in the middle of the road. There weren't any lights on the road. And since it was completely dark, we almost hit this guy that was staring blankly ahead, watching us nearly hit him. And the most appalling part is that he never flinched. Just kept staring past our vehicle, pale as a ghost, wearing all black and no footwear. My immediate thought after we avoid killing this dude is, "Oh shit, he's a meth head that has wandered out of the woods somewhere." But he was fairly young and didn't have the look of someone that was high on drugs. He never bothered to even look at us, and just kept staring into the distance endlessly. I rolled the window down to ask him if he was alright, by which he snapped out of his gaze and walked to the side of our car. He said he had been in an accident, and then he kind of stammered out a story. He was definitely in shock, but things weren't adding up. He was saying he rolled his car, but there was no car around. There are rows of pine trees on both sides of the road, so his car couldn't have rolled very far. He wasn't aggressive in any way, and he didn't seem to be intoxicated, apart from having a far-off stare. And the strangest part of the entire encounter was the way he asked for a ride. It wasn't like a typical,
"Hey man, my car is gone and I don't have a phone. Can you give me a lift to my house?"
He kept repeating himself over and over again.
Will you please invite me into your vehicle?
He seemed stranded, and I didn't want to just leave this young guy who, besides being shoeless in the middle of an empty highway wearing all black, seemed like a fairly clean dude, but I had this knot in my stomach. I was about to drive him to the closest gas station when I, probably just recovering from the adrenaline dump of having nearly run over someone, noticed he had no wounds or blood on him. I told him we didn't have phones, and to wait by the side of the road while we drove to the convenience store to call the police and drove off. In the rear view, he just stood there watching us drive away, exactly how he watched us ride up on him. As soon as we rode off, my girlfriend said that she thought he might have been a vampire. I mean, we saw no wrecked car on the remaining stretch of highway, and the police never caught up with him to see what his deal was, but it was freaky as shit. And I have heard that vampires require consent. Maybe that's why he kept asking for our permission. One summer night when I first met my boyfriend, we decided to drive to Charleston in South Carolina to visit my sister. Now, just so you know, that specific part of South Carolina is still a very old world and gives off freakishly haunted vibes. I mean, the trees here are draped with Spanish moss, and it is hot and humid and bug-infested. The whole scene was straight out of a horror movie. As the sun started to go down, it began to cool down, and so we started waking up. My car had no air conditioner, so we were overheated and silent. It was rapidly getting dark when I realized that there were no street lights out there. No street lights, and we hadn't passed a gas station in a very long time. We weren't even driving past any other drivers anymore. I asked my boyfriend if he wanted to drive, and he willingly obliged. Now that part of South Carolina is flat. The roads are straight and there are fields and trees and swamps on either side. Far ahead, I could see a light that was maybe a street light of some kind. I planned on pulling over there to change places. I started slowing down as we got closer to the spot. We almost slowed down to stop, and that's when I saw that the light ahead was moving. And it wasn't light. It was the fire. It was a car on flames. It was in the middle of nowhere, engulfed in flames and burning on the side of the road with no one around. I was so bewildered by what I saw that I'd taken my foot off the gas. My boyfriend was alarmed.
Go! Go!
And I put my foot down. He then told me there were a couple of people standing just in the line of trees. They hunkered down at first, but when I slowed down, they stood up. This was before the era of smartphones. We just fled from there. There was no mention of anything about it on the radio or in the paper in the next few days. The moral of the story is, do not stop in unknown places, especially where there's room for people to hide nearby and ambush your vehicle. About 3 months ago, I was on my way home from work. I was driving late at night, around 1 a.m. The road was pretty empty, and I was just listening to some songs, excited to just hop in my bed the moment I get home. But off in the far distance, as I was driving along, I saw a large figure lying down on the side of the road. The first thought I had was that it was a deer or some large animal that had been hit by a car and pulled off to the side. But as I got closer, it started to look more and more like a human. Sure enough, my light shined right on it as I passed. It was a man, and for the second I got a look at him, he might have been missing his head. I still don't remember it completely sure, but a part of me doesn't want to. My mouth just fell open and I just stared at the road ahead, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no one around, except for about 200 feet away, where a woman and her passenger were pulled over and frantically speaking outside of their van. As I kept driving, I saw more and more people pulled over and talking to each other. I'm confident that they had obviously seen him too. I couldn't believe it until I saw him on the news the next morning, and sure enough, it was the woman in the van who hit him. There was no explanation as to what he was doing walking on the side of the interstate that 2 at 1 a.m. About 15 years ago, I was in my mid-20s. On an exhausting long trip from Washington State to Montana, I was driving through North Dakota, through that long boring stretch. It was late at night and we hadn't stopped for a long time, aiming to do the whole stint in a day. I began to notice a truck that crept up slowly behind me, but hadn't passed for a long while. I sensed a weird feeling, so I messed with my speed. Up to 90, down to 30, but the driver behind me maintained his pace. I'm down to barely a quarter tank, so I pull off at the next sign of a gas station. The truck follows us there too. I'm scared and freaking out, wondering if I should call the police. And what do I tell them? It sounded dumb that a car on the highway is going in the same direction as me. I finally wake my sister, and she tells me to chill. 2 gas stations were in sight. One was open and had no cars, while the other one is closed but with 2 troopers pulled on having a chat. Thank God. But as I pull into the sweet safety of law enforcement, they both pull away. And the truck is still following me. I pull up to the pump, my heart is racing, but my sister just orders me to fill it up. As I climb out, I see 2 dudes get out of the truck and watch me. I think that this is where we get kidnapped, raped, and murdered. But I get to work and my sister slides out of the passenger seat. She lights a cigarette and starts to talk to the gents. She asks where they're headed, they say Duluth. As I'm screwing the gas cap on, my sister, cool as a cucumber, flips open her phone and takes a pic of their truck and them. She bids them safe travel and climbs back in. Both of our cars get on the highway again. They pass us and speed away. We reach the place safely. One time I was driving with my girlfriend through Wisconsin on the way back home. It was really late, like 1 or 2 in the morning, and I stopped at a gas station to fill up my tank. My GPS ended up putting me on a small highway instead of the expressway right away, after leaving from there, but I didn't want to complicate things more, so I just followed it. My girlfriend was sleeping, so I had the radio turned off and drove in complete silence on this really dark, creepy highway. There were deer crossing signs, so I was driving extra cautiously because a family friend had recently hit a deer in their truck, which did quite a number on it and also caused her to break her arm from the impact. I saw there was a pretty sharp curve coming up, so I slowed down to make the turn as carefully as possible, and as I'm turning I see a figure exiting in the darkness of the woods. It was a large mountain lion, with blood stained all over the front of its face. It literally scared the fuck out of me. I pulled up just after the turn and tried to wake my girlfriend up. I could see its large shadow make its way across the road in my rearview mirror, but by the time my girlfriend woke up it was gone. She had lived in Wisconsin most of her life and immediately dismissed my claims that it was a mountain lion, because they are not really from that area. I told her I knew what I saw, but she insisted that I was seeing things. I acted like she was probably right and continued the trip back, but I know what I saw. I remember that one night my wife and I couldn't get our 2-year-old and 1-year-old to go to sleep. They were driving the both of us a little crazy with their constant crying, and the worst part is that none of our usual strategies were working, and it was making us aggressive at each other. I suggested an evening drive to calm everyone down, and my wife was more than relieved at the idea. We quickly packed up the kids and headed out. The idea was to take a typically quiet county highway for a few miles to the interstate, drive about 10 to 12 miles west, then turn around and come home. The stretch of this county highway is particularly lacking in street lights, especially considering that it's located in the busy suburbs of the New York City. We had just left the local road leading to the county highway and gotten up to speed, which was about 50 miles per hour, when I spotted something in the road ahead. This stretch of the highway was frequently crossed by deers and other animals, and it's not uncommon for freshly struck carcasses to be littered with them. By the time I alerted my wife that there was something in the road, we were passing it, and it definitely wasn't a deer. We were traveling in the middle lane, on a dark highway, doing 50 miles per hour, and a person was crossing the fast lane into the path of our car. I don't think my wife and I would have been so chilled by someone crossing this section of the road, had it not been for the rest of the circumstances. Firstly, as mentioned previously too, we were already a little rattled at each other with the kids not complying with their usual bedtime routine. Next, while my wife was glad to get out of the house on this particular night, such so-called nap rides had become a thing of the past ever since our second child was born. Not only was it twice the work to pack and unpack the kids in and out of the car, but we also had twice the precious cargo to keep safe. It just didn't seem worth the trouble and risk most of the times. Although this was an exception. Perhaps the thing that shook us both the deepest out on that dark section of highway was that there were absolutely no cars in front or behind us. This person didn't have to cross at that time. They could have crossed with zero risk either 15 seconds earlier or later of us passing by. Finally, I thought the person was holding a big stick or bat. My wife didn't see this, but she also was not the first to spot the person. This stick was what tipped the scale and triggered us to call 911. The 911 operator didn't initially think the call deserved a police response. No one had been hurt, and she said people cross the highway there on foot all the time. It wasn't until I mentioned that I thought the person had a stick that the operator said she was dispatching someone to check it out. We hung up, relieved that perhaps we'd helped prevent someone who was either crazy or intoxicated, not hurt someone else or themselves. What we didn't know this whole time was that our 3-year-old was aware of everything that was happening. He'd not fallen asleep yet and heard us call 911 and specifically mention that a person was in the road. I suspect that he detected we were alarmed, and when we told him it was a deer in the road that we called the police about, he said,
"But I heard you say a person, not a deer."
We felt bad for lying to him, but at the time it seemed like the right thing to do was to persist that it had been a deer and encourage him to go to sleep. We continued on towards the interstate, quietly talking about the circumstances that led us to call the cops, convincing each other that it was the right thing to do. Both kids were sound asleep by the time we made it to the juncture where I'd planned to turn around. I don't usually take the same way back home from places, mostly just for a change of scenery, and this is what I had planned to do on this night. As we took the eastbound service road towards the alternate route home, traffic came to a stop because of a car accident ahead. There was still an opportunity to take the same interstate back, so I took it, somewhat relieved that we could pass the same spot where the person was in the road, maybe getting closure that nothing bad had happened. We were only on that same dark county highway heading towards home for a few minutes when I saw the flashing lights against the trees lining the highway. They were still mostly hidden around a big bend in the road ahead. I slowed down, my heart sinking with my wife's, the both of us already knowing what had happened. We were the first car to be stopped on the highway. From where we were stopped, we could see a car crashed near the trees lining on the side. Its glass was shattered from the front, and there were no people visible. But the bat that the man had held before was lying on the road a few yards ahead. As the cop whose car was closest to the body approached our car, I heard stirring in the back seat. "Oh no," I thought. Thankfully, just as our 3-year popped his head up and asked what was going, an ambulance pulled behind the cop and blocked the view of the body from our child. Before the cop could say anything, we told him what we'd seen right at this spot only 15 minutes before, while heading in the opposite direction. We told him we were the ones who had called the cops while out on our nap ride, and he told us to stay where we were so he could get our info. He returned and told us about the entire incident. Just a few minutes after we drove past the guy on the highway, there was another car. The driver was alone in the car, and he stopped upon watching him standing right in the middle of the road. The moment he slowed down, this dude charged towards him with the bat and struck the windshield. The driver floored his vehicle and bumped him while attempting to escape, subsequently hitting him hard. The crazy guy injured himself quite badly and fell on the side. 3 hours later, we made that turn on the closed highway, exited the entrance, and went home. In the days that followed, both my wife and I were sad and reflective about the situation. Having to rehash everything to an investigator a week later, we got a closure. The man was supposedly a psycho killer on the loose. There was a charge sheet on him and the local police were already on a lookout. He was notorious for stopping unwary drivers asking for help and then killing them for fun. The police could get there on time to help the injured driver and catch hold of the psycho killer too. About 7 years ago, I was driving across the New Mexico and Colorado border at around 3 a.m. I was supposed to drive another 150 miles, and I knew I didn't have enough fuel. I was looking for a place to stop and refill my fuel tank. I had missed one gas station when I was in a dilemma if I should stop and refill at that moment or find one a few miles further. But after skipping that one, there wasn't a single one visible for over an hour. I was worried, and mainly it was late. I did not want to be in the middle of nowhere when I run out of fuel. Luckily, I happened to reach a town that was probably the smallest and saddest little farm town, and it had only one tiny gas station. Now I hadn't seen another car on the highway for hours, and it was freezing cold outside. I drove to reach the gas station that looked like a food takeaway joint. And honestly, it felt like this town was abandoned like a ghost town. I mean, it was that quiet. Total pin drop silence, apart from my engine. And forget humans, I don't even spot any cars parked anywhere. Frankly speaking, I felt that it was kind of a cool place to explore, except for the unbearing cold weather. Now as I approach the station, I don't see anyone around at all. So I wear an extra jacket and jump out of my truck. I'm pumping away and refilling my truck, feeling like I'm completely alone in this whole damn town, until I notice another car in the shadows, quietly sitting near the back of the building. It was a flashy black lowrider with completely tinted windows. And there were 4 guys leaning against it. And I don't know how to describe those 4 people's outfits and looks. But for me, the simplest way to help you picturize them would be by asking you to visualize a gang of 4 men in a Mexican gangster movie. Yes, I am not exaggerating. And I remember chuckling to myself in slight shock because firstly, they startled the hell out of me. And secondly, they were wearing black shorts, wife-beater tank tops, and the usual knee-high socks. Now do not forget that it was freezing cold out there, and it was the middle of nowhere. Despite that, they looked so damn casual. And without a word, all 4 of them got off the car. They started walking straight towards me, until I could see the full sleeves and face tattoos under the lights of the gas station that I was in. I dropped the gas pump, dashed inside my truck, fired up the motor, and did the quickest 0 to 100 that my beloved truck had ever witnessed. And while I jumped into my truck, I remember them shouting and running toward me. I shut the door and gunned towards the exit. I did not want to be in this town any longer. I sped my way and got to the highway. But not 30 seconds after burning out onto the highway, I noticed headlights swerve out onto my lane and follow me. Little did they know, I beat up looking at a Dodge truck that had the Hemi motor and a couple of cool upgrades. I knew that they never had a chance to catch up with me. I was startled by the noise of a gunshot. I sped as fast as I could, and I'll be honest with you, at one point, I thought I might burn out my engine. But I had to risk it. These crazy men might be wanting to loot or kill me, or sell off my body parts to some black market, and I couldn't risk myself getting caught by them. The road was pretty smooth, and that helped me maintain pace, or for that matter increase our gap too. And after a few miles, I heard another loud gunshot. And their headlights disappeared in my rearview mirror. I kept driving because another trucker friend of mine had told me about a similar incident, where he assumed that he was not being chased anymore, only to learn that they had stealthily crept closer to him with their lights off. Although in my case, I was lucky. I kept driving for the next few hours and eventually got where I was supposed to reach. They were pretty surprised, because I had reached significantly earlier than they had expected. I mean, of course. I didn't think much of it, and even laughed at how badly I outran them, till a cop buddy told me something that sent shivers down my spine. As a cop, he was aware of the Mexican cartels running drugs through that ghost town to avoid the interstate. I was stunned to know that my guess was correct. And it took me a while to grasp the reality that I had pulled myself out of those jaws of death. And from that day onwards, no matter how desperate I am, I do not enter their ghost towns or abandoned places. They are abandoned for a reason, and it is best to leave them that way. So this happened when my young wife and I were moving between cities. We had spent the entire day loading a large 16-feet trailer with all our belongings. It tired us out and we were left exhausted by the end of it, but we did not rest. Mainly because we wanted to begin the drive across the state, just before it got dark. And mind you, this was way back in 1980s. The headlights weren't as strong back then. I had borrowed a large pickup truck to pull the heavy trailer to our destination, so the combination of this truck and the fully loaded trailer was extremely heavy. And because of its heavy weight, it was pretty slow and cumbersome to start and stop the truck. We were traveling along a very desolate stretch of the highway at around midnight. We were driving roughly 60 to 65 miles per hour when I noticed something that looked like a couple of deers walking out into the road ahead of us. And they were like around 200 yards ahead of us. My wife was fast asleep on the seat next to me. I began to slow down a bit because I knew it'll take a while to slow down, and meanwhile, I pressed the horn to scare the animals off the road before we would reach them. Now where we live, this is a fairly common occurrence. These dumb deers randomly show up on the road. Or worse, they jump onto a moving vehicle and shatter the window glass unintentionally. But they are startled by loud noises and horns generally scare them off easily. So I'm not slamming on the brakes in full force, because I expect these deers will move well before we get there. You know, as I said, they usually do that. But for some reason, they stood firm, and that put me in a state of panic. As we got closer, I suddenly realized as these two so-called deers came clearly into the light of our headlights, that these aren't deers. They were two men, and they were trying to stop our truck. Now the road we were driving on was only a two-lane highway, and one man was standing in the middle of our lane, and the other was standing right in the middle of the opposite lane. By now there was absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to stop this rig, and they weren't leaving me anywhere to go. They had their reasons to expect that I would be eventually stopping, unless I was a psychopath that would run my truck over them with no regrets. But they didn't realize that I couldn't stop. It was beyond my capacity to stop the truck at that speed, and that too within that short, ever-decreasing distance. I stomp on the brake pedal and continue to blare the horn over and over again and as fast as possible, hopefully getting them to move off my path. I'm fighting to keep the truck and trailer from jackknifing, brakes locked up and tires screaming, but these guys are not moving or showing any signs of fear. All this while I'm still going 35 to 40 miles per hour when I had almost reached them. The only thing that I could do at that point was to try and thread through the needle-like gap between them. So I center the truck in the middle of the roadway and hope that neither of them tries to close that small window. At the very last second, the guy who's standing in the middle of our lane jumps out of the way. He was so close that I was seriously worried our big rearview mirror might hit him in the head. I missed hitting him by mere inches. This all happened in a span of about 5 to 10 seconds. There was no car anywhere on the road, and we were way out in the middle of nowhere, and it was pretty obvious, based on their behavior, that these two guys were up to something potentially nefarious. I didn't stop, and I didn't even bother to. I had already come way too damn close to killing these guys. My heart was literally in my throat, and it was pounding so hard that I was having trouble breathing for the next few minutes. I didn't even realize until afterward that when I'd slammed on the brakes, my wife had slid off the seat and onto the floor of the truck. Just FYI, seatbelts were not mandatory back in those days. She groggily gets up off the floor and asks me,
What the hell just happened?
She had missed the events that had unfolded merely a minute ago. And I'm thankful that she didn't, because it would have scarred her for life. It scared the shit out of me. And I've never come so close to killing someone in my life, and I truly hope I never do again. Oh, and by the way, we reached there safely. And we unpacked a day later. We settled well over there and got accustomed within a week itself. I made friends with the local sheriff as he was my neighbor too. And over a drink, I told him about this entire incident from that night. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that I should have had run my truck over those criminals. Because good people stop their cars so as to save the lives of these goons, they end up getting looted or worse, murdered. And sometimes they even target cop cars, where they pretend to be lost and in need of help. Then the moment they find the officer is not alert, they attack and steal whatever they can. And at night, it is always difficult to make out and remember the faces. And he mentioned that I could always claim that I had to run over them for my own safety, which was more than justified in the eyes of the law. Henceforth, I have made it a point that if I ever encounter such goons, I would realize my lifelong dream of playing GTA with my real car. But jokes apart, if that's what it takes to save my family and myself, I would do it without any regrets. What about you? Before I begin, I'll provide a bit of background. I'm a truck driver, and unlike the usual long-distance drives, I was specifically doing shuttle runs for a factory in my city. I run loaded trailers from the factory downtown to a warehouse that is situated around 20 miles away. That warehouse is where I drop my loaded trailer, exchange it for an empty one, and take it straight back to the factory where I started my journey. I run this route like 8 to 10 times a night every day. I'm told that it's a diamond in the rough, as far as trucking jobs go. Anyway, my route has me cross this rather precarious highway bridge on each return trip. The bridge is only 2 lanes wide, with no shoulder. The speed limit on the highway is 70 miles an hour, but this bridge has a steep drop and a sharp curve down to surface level, so the recommended speed to take this curve is 45. A few months ago, around 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, I was in the process of rounding this curve when a car was blocking the bridge, and I nearly plowed right into it. The car didn't lose control or smash into anything, there weren't any tire tracks on the pavement, and the car didn't have any damage. The car was a brand new Mercedes SUV with dealer tags, so it probably wasn't broken down. And nobody was in the car. Whoever was driving must have just decided to come to a complete stop in the middle of this practically blind corner, get out of his car, and walk away. The car couldn't have been there for longer than 30 minutes or so, because it wasn't there when I drove past that bridge in the other direction. I didn't see anyone walking along the highway too. I have no idea what was going on, and I called the cops to get that car, and I never heard anything about it that night. A week later, another driver told me about what he had heard. Apparently, a man had committed suicide on the bridge that night. He jumped down that bridge while he was on his duty. The reason was unknown, but the body was found a day later. It gave me chills knowing that had he been there 30 minutes earlier, I might have had the opportunity to save his life. Rest in peace. About 15 years ago, my sister and I were driving on our way home. It was quite late at night, and the road was deserted at that hour. The stretch of that road is around 3 miles, and it is surrounded by trees on both sides. We were speaking about random stuff on the way, and suddenly we could both see something on the road up ahead. It wasn't still. It was moving at a constant pace with our car, but it wasn't running and it looked weird. So I asked her what it was, and my sister said she too didn't have a clue. And I don't know how to describe it, but it looked like a black garbage bag. My sister too said that it really looked like a bag flying on the road, flapping along the wind to stay afloat. I was curious, so I sped up a bit and tried to catch up with it. Now you wouldn't believe it, but as we approached, it completely changed its shape. It went from being quite flat and small to morphing into a fully grown man on a bike. He was just there in the middle of the road, riding his bike. We were dumbstruck by what we had just seen. And all of it happened within moments. Maybe 10 seconds. I caught up alongside him and asked if he was okay. He nodded but didn't speak anything, and then he drove off at an unmatchable speed. The most peculiar part is that it made no noise. I mean, generally, a motorcycle would get noisier after speeding up, but this one did not. And this was like in the early 2000s, so today's technology did not exist. To this day, we still talk about it because it was the strangest, creepiest thing ever, and we both still can't explain what we saw. My bet is that it was some sort of secret government tech, while my sister believes that it was an alien that we saw. When I mentioned it to my friends and family, we joked that it must be some sort of secret teleportation technology. I was around 20, and I was driving home from my boyfriend's house. It was a familiar route, so I wasn't super cautious or worried per se. I stopped at a red light on the very edge of town. I remember all of the city lights were behind me, while the cornfields and shelter belts were ahead of me. Now, because it was like around 3, and that too in the middle of the night, I was the only one sitting at the red light. It was a pleasant night, and I had had a great time meeting his parents. While reminiscing about those moments, I saw something moving in my peripheral vision. Now, because of my location, I thought it was going to be a deer. But deers don't creep in towards you. They'll either jump in or out randomly. This one seemed like slowly creeping in on me, you know, like a predator. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with a man who was maybe in his 50s. I was relieved, as I'm paranoid about bobcats already. But I wondered, why was he creeping towards my car? When he noticed that I saw him, he froze, and it was then that I noticed he had a tire iron. I ran the red light and sped out of there. I called my boyfriend and told him about it. He took his car, and his elder brother hid in the back seat. But they didn't find him there. In 10 minutes, he was gone without a trace. Almost about 3 years ago, my brother and I were making a cross-country journey, and we were planning on stopping off in Arizona to meet some friends. As soon as we entered Arizona, there were highway notices everywhere that there was an escaped convict. Now it was about 2 a.m. by the time we got there, so we were already in a bit of a strange mood. There was something about the entire drive through the desert that felt super eerie. And it was strange to a point that one of us even mentioned it, and we started joking about the spooky claims people make while traveling through the area. You know, like the existence of aliens that abduct unwary travelers, skinwalkers chasing you down, and ghosts that haunt drivers. While we were having this conversation, this crazy-looking animal ran across the road right in front of us. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it looked too wolf-like to be a deer. But it moved like a deer and was too lanky to be a coyote. And it even had a long tail like that of a cougar. Moreover, it was big. I slammed on my brakes, and it ran off into the brush on the side. We both just started screaming and then laughing. We have no clue what it was. At first, I thought that it must be a cougar with mange. But the more I thought about it, the less sure I was of what it was that we saw. It also didn't make any noise like a growl or a scream out of shock. My house is on a back road in the country, and so whenever I need to head to town, I have to travel through this small Amish settlement. And I almost always end up having to pass by an Amish carriage. It's a common occurrence, and they're usually friendly and pull as much to the side as they can so as to let cars pass them by. But this one time I was behind an Amish carriage. It was going unbelievably slow. So I came up behind them, checked to make sure it was clear, and passed by. And I very vividly remember looking at them as I passed in my rear view, looking ahead to the road, and then looking back in my rear view to see that nothing was there. No horse, no carriage, and no human. And mind you, there were no roads to turn on, nor hills to cut off my sight. 1 second they were there, and the very next they just weren't. And I have never had a ghost-like experience before. Nor have anyone heard about such paranormal experiences in the village. I wasn't drunk, and I still have no explanation. I have heard about phantom trucks and such phenomena. But phantom horses? That's a new thing for me.